Welcome, dear listener, to a quiet journey into the world of Victorian women. Tonight we step back into an age of elegance and hardship, of strict social codes and hidden resilience. From grand drawing rooms to crowded factories, their lives reveal the complexity of a society in transition. Settle in, breathe slowly, and let this gentle exploration of history carry you toward peace and rest. When the young Queen Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, she inherited not only the crown of the British Isles, but also the responsibility of embodying an era that would soon bear her name. The world she entered was one of contrasts. The grime of industrial London pressed against the manicured lawns of aristocratic estates, and the thunder of machinery in the Midlands was accompanied by the hushed prayers of parish churches across the countryside. In this complex world, women's lives were shaped by forces larger than themselves: tradition, law, religion, and the rapid transformations of industry and empire. To understand the story of Victorian women, one must first breathe in the atmosphere of that time, for it was heavy with both hope and restriction. The ideal of womanhood that the 19th century pressed upon its daughters was not born in a vacuum. It was the culmination of centuries of English social thought, moulded by Protestant morality, classical philosophy, and Enlightenment ideals, yet hardened into something uniquely Victorian. The woman was expected to be the angel in the house, a phrase popularised by Coventry Patmore's sentimental poem of 1854. She was to be pure, self-sacrificing, tender and domestic, her sphere limited to hearth and home. Yet outside the parlour windows the world was shifting. The roar of trains, the smoke of factories and the cries of street vendors filled the air, and the empire stretched across continents, bringing with it new wealth and new anxieties. Women were told that their place was fixed, yet the very changes in society demanded their participation in new ways. In London, the largest city the world had ever seen, the streets themselves told the tale of inequality. Carriages clattered along the wide boulevards of Mayfair, where the wives of merchants and minor aristocrats displayed the latest fashions of Paris, their skirts sweeping over carefully scrubbed pavements. A few miles east, in the teeming districts of Whitechapel and Bethnal Green, women of the working classes bent over looms, stitched garments by candlelight, or hawked fish in markets thick with the stench of smoke and sweat. In both places, women's identities were tightly controlled, though by different means. In the parlours of the West End, propriety and etiquette were the invisible chains. In the factories of the East, poverty and exhaustion dictated existence. Education, too, was divided along class lines. For the daughters of the upper classes, boarding schools offered lessons in French, music and needlework, but rarely mathematics or science. The aim was not intellectual independence, but social polish, the cultivation of refinement that would serve them in the marriage market. For the daughters of mechanics and labourers, schooling was often limited to Sunday lessons at church or a few precious years in overcrowded charity schools. Literacy rates slowly climbed across the century, especially after the Education Act of 1870 made elementary education compulsory. But for much of the Victorian age, millions of girls entered adulthood without more than the rudiments of reading and writing. This imbalance in education underpinned the broader inequality of the sexes, reinforcing the idea that women were not to compete in the world of reason and politics, but to remain bound by duty and dependence. The law was another formidable structure hemming women into narrow roles. The legal doctrine of coverture, inherited from centuries of English common law, meant that upon marriage a woman's legal identity was effectively swallowed by that of her husband. She could not own property in her own right, sign contracts or control her wages. A single woman, or widow, retained some independence, but the societal pressure to marry was immense, and with marriage came the surrender of autonomy. Cases of cruelty or desertion left women with little recourse. Divorce was nearly unattainable before the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, and even then the process remained costly and morally stigmatised. Women were told that their virtue lay in submission, that their salvation was in obedience, and that their purpose was bound to the domestic sphere. Yet reality, as always, was more complex than the ideal. Women of the middle and upper classes were not simply passive ornaments in their homes. They managed households, often supervising numerous servants and intricate social obligations. A lady of society might spend her mornings corresponding with relatives and acquaintances, her afternoons receiving visitors in the drawing room, and their evenings attending the theatre or a charitable function. This world of constant social performance required intelligence, tact, and resilience. Even in the gilded cage of domesticity, women exercised influence, though always indirectly, always in the shadow of their husbands or fathers. For the poor, the story was grimmer. In the dark, damp cellars of industrial cities, women gave birth with little medical assistance, raised children while taking in laundry, and worked long hours at looms or sewing machines. Reports of factory inspectors in the 1840s noted that women and children alike toiled in conditions that sapped the strength and stunted the growth of the body. Mortality rates among working-class mothers were appallingly high. Childbirth was a perilous frontier, and the spread of cholera and typhus claimed countless lives in overcrowded districts. To survive required endurance that defied the sentimental portraits of feminine fragility painted in the magazines of the middle classes. Religion permeated every level of society, reinforcing the expectations of piety and submission. Sunday was a sacred day, when families gathered for worship, and sermons often emphasized the duties of wives and daughters to obey and support their menfolk. The Bible, interpreted through the lens of Victorian morality, provided justification for the hierarchy of gender roles. Yet religion also offered women opportunities for engagement beyond the home. Missionary societies, temperance movements, and charitable organizations allowed women to organize, to speak publicly, and to shape the moral conscience of the nation. In these seemingly acceptable outlets, the seeds of later feminist activism were quietly sown. Against this backdrop, Queen Victoria herself became both symbol and paradox. As monarch, she wielded immense influence, embodying stability and moral authority. She bore 9 children and publicly extolled the virtues of domesticity, yet she was also the head of state, commanding loyalty from millions across the empire. To many women, she was proof that femininity and power could coexist, even if society at large insisted otherwise. Her long reign became the framework in which debates over women's roles were staged, and her own contradictions mirrored the complexities of her era. Literature of the time revealed the undercurrents of discontent. The novels of the Bronte sisters, Elizabeth Gaskell and George Eliot, painted vivid portraits of women struggling against social confines. Jane Eyre's insistence on her own moral and emotional independence, Margaret Hale's confrontation with industrial realities, and Dorothea Brooke's yearning for intellectual fulfillment, all were fictional reflections of real anxieties simmering beneath the polished surface of Victorian respectability. To read these novels in their time was to encounter both recognition and discomfort, for they spoke truths that many preferred to leave unspoken. The Victorian woman, then, cannot be understood as a single figure. She was at once the angel in the house and the drudge in the factory, the genteel hostess and the weary mother, the charitable visitor and the silent thinker. She inhabited drawing rooms and workhouses, nurseries and hospitals, schools and streets. Her story is one of multiplicity, of contradictions woven together by the threads of history. At the dawn of the era, she stood poised between centuries of tradition and the faint glimmer of new possibilities. She could not yet foresee the suffrage rallies of the early 20th century, the gradual opening of universities to women, or the slow dismantling of coverture laws. But the world around her was changing, and in subtle ways so was she. As the lamps of London flickered to life in the evenings, casting long shadows across cobblestones and gaslit parlours, Victorian women prepared themselves for another day lived within boundaries not of their own making. Some would bow their heads and conform, others would quietly resist, and a few would take the first daring steps toward transformation. The story of their lives begins in these shadows, where ideals and realities collided, and where every decision carried the weight of society's expectations. It is here, in the tension between what was prescribed and what was lived, that the history of Victorian womanhood takes shape, ready to unfold across the decades of a century defined by both restraint and revolution. In the hushed halls of Victorian mansions, where velvet curtains muffled the sound of the outside world and polished marble floors reflected the shimmer of gaslight chandeliers, the lives of upper-class women unfolded in a delicate balance between privilege and constraint. To the casual observer, theirs was a life of leisure and elegance, a world of glittering soirees, glittering jewels, and vast country estates where servants stood ready at a bell's ring. Yet beneath the gilded surface lay an intricate web of obligations, anxieties, and invisible chains, as binding in their way as the soot and poverty that trapped the working classes. For an upper-class woman, birth was destiny. From the moment she entered the world, her path was shaped by the expectations of lineage, wealth, and marriage. A daughter of the aristocracy was more than a child. She was a future alliance, a potential link between families, fortunes, and titles. Her parents invested in her upbringing not primarily to cultivate her independent mind, but to prepare her to shine as an ornament of her family's name. From the nursery onward, her days were structured by governesses who drilled her in languages, embroidery, music, and deportment. She might practice the piano for hours, learn to paint delicate watercolours of flowers, and recite passages of poetry, all the while being gently reminded that these were not ends in themselves, but accomplishments designed to make her pleasing in society. As she grew older, her world expanded into the drawing rooms and ballrooms of London's social season. Every spring, families of the upper classes descended upon the capital for the season, a ritualised cycle of dinners, concerts, theatre outings, and most importantly balls, where young women were presented to society and potential suitors. The infamous coming out at court, where debutantes curtsied before the Queen, was the formal initiation into this glittering marketplace of marriage. To succeed in this sphere required far more than beauty. It required impeccable manners, fashionable attire, and the ability to navigate the subtleties of conversation and social networks. Mothers coached their daughters carefully, aware that a favourable marriage could secure both status and financial security for generations. Marriage itself was the central pivot of an upper-class woman's life. Few avenues existed outside it for a woman who failed to marry, risked becoming a burden upon her family, condemned to the ambiguous role of spinsterhood. Matches were often strategic, designed to consolidate estates, preserve titles, or increase influence. While novels of the period sometimes romanticised marriage as a union of hearts, in reality it was also a union of ledgers and land deeds. The aristocracy guarded its wealth through careful negotiation, and women were the silent currency of these transactions. Once married, the bride moved into her husband's household, her dowry transferred, her legal identity absorbed into his under the doctrine of coverture. Within the walls of her new home, the upper-class wife assumed a role that was at once powerful and powerless. She was mistress of the household, overseeing the staff of servants who maintained the estate. A grand country house might employ dozens, housemaids, cooks, footmen, gardeners, grooms, and more, all under her nominal supervision. She was responsible for maintaining standards of propriety, ensuring that the household reflected the dignity of its family. Guests must be entertained with elegance, linens pressed to perfection, meals executed with precision. A failure in these matters reflected not only upon her, but upon the prestige of her husband. And yet, despite this sphere of authority, her power was circumscribed. The estate itself, the servants' wages, the family accounts, all legally belonged to her husband. She managed, but she did not own. Her daily life was punctuated by rituals of refinement. Morning might begin with correspondence, answering letters that connected her family to networks of relatives, acquaintances, and charitable committees. Afternoons often involved receiving visitors, partaking in tea, or attending to the education of her children, for while tutors and governesses carried much of that burden, the mother was expected to instill values and supervise moral development. Evenings brought entertainment, private dinners, music recitals, or public theatre performances. A calendar filled with such engagements could appear leisurely, but it demanded stamina and skill. The perpetual demand to present oneself gracefully, to embody virtue and taste, weighed heavily upon many women. Fashion played a central role in this performance. Dresses of silk and satin, elaborately trimmed with lace, ribbons, and jewels, were not merely personal adornments but symbols of status. A lady's wardrobe communicated her family's wealth and her own social position. Corsets cinched the waist to emphasize a delicate figure, while wide crinolines or bustles sculpted the silhouette according to the dictates of fashion. The practical discomfort of these garments, the difficulty of movement, the risk of fainting from tight lacing, was borne in silence, for beauty was duty, and duty was everything. Hairdressing, gloves, fans, and jewellery completed the ensemble, each detail scrutinised in the competitive environment of society gatherings. Motherhood was another crucial role. An upper-class woman might bear numerous children, with the expectation of producing heirs to carry on the family line. Childbirth, however, was fraught with danger even in the grandest houses. Medical knowledge was limited, and many women died in confinement despite their wealth. Survivors often endured repeated pregnancies, their health compromised by the demands placed upon their bodies. Infants, too, were vulnerable to disease, yet motherhood was also one of the few avenues through which women could exert lasting influence. In raising sons who would inherit estates and daughters who would become future wives, mothers shaped the moral and intellectual fibre of the next generation. Religion and morality infused these responsibilities with a sense of divine order. The ideal of the pious, submissive and nurturing wife was reinforced from pulpits and within family prayers. Religious devotion was not only a private matter but a social expectation, demonstrated through attendance at church, support of charitable causes, and the cultivation of a moral atmosphere within the home. For many women, philanthropy became an acceptable outlet for public engagement. They organised charitable bazaars, visited the poor, contributed to missionary societies, and lent their names to hospitals and schools. While these activities were framed as extensions of feminine compassion, they also allowed women to exercise organisational skills and a degree of leadership in civic life. Yet beneath the surface of propriety, discontent occasionally stirred. Some women bristled against the constraints of their gilded lives, aware that their accomplishments, however genuine, were dismissed as mere ornaments. Private diaries reveal frustrations with idle routines, loveless marriages, and the constant pressure to maintain appearances. Others sought intellectual fulfillment, reading voraciously or engaging in quiet correspondence with thinkers of the age. The mid to late 19th century saw the emergence of women who challenged the confines of their station, advocating for education, property rights and social reform. But in the drawing rooms of mid-Victorian England, such ideas were often whispered rather than proclaimed. The paradox of the upper-class woman lay in the tension between visibility and invisibility. She was always on display, her every gesture observed and judged by the standards of society, yet her voice carried little weight in the spheres of law, politics and economy. She shaped the atmosphere of the household and the upbringing of children, but the deeds of her husband determined the family's public reputation. She could influence indirectly, through persuasion, charm or quiet counsel, but her formal authority was almost non-existent. The gilded cage in which she lived was comfortable, even enviable to those outside it, but it was a cage nonetheless. Still, one must not underestimate the resilience and adaptability of these women. They learned to maneuver within their boundaries, to cultivate networks of influence through kinship, patronage and philanthropy. Some became renowned hostesses whose salons attracted politicians, artists and intellectuals. Others supported reform movements from behind the scenes, financing campaigns or encouraging their husbands to champion progressive causes. While the law and custom sought to silence them, they found ways to make themselves heard in subtler registers. As the century progressed, cracks began to appear in the walls of the gilded cage. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 granted wives the right to own property in their own name, a profound shift that began to redefine the legal landscape. Universities slowly opened their doors to women, and periodicals debated the woman question with increasing urgency. For the upper-class woman, these changes were felt first as whispers at dinner tables, as controversies in newspapers, as novels that dared to imagine heroines who defied convention. The transformation was gradual, but it was real. Yet, in the 1840s and 1850s, before these reforms took root, the life of an upper-class woman was still defined largely by her roles as daughter, wife, and mother. To walk through the corridors of a Victorian mansion in those years was to encounter the paradox of privilege and constraint at every turn. The mistress of the house might glide through her drawing room in silks worth a labourer's yearly wage, her words polite, her smile composed. Servants bowed as she passed, and visitors admired her grace. But behind her eyes lingered the knowledge that her freedom, her future, and even her fortune were bound to the will of another. She was the angel of the house, revered and restricted, honoured and confined. And though the world outside her windows was shifting, factories rising, railways stretching, and ideas fermenting, Within her gilded cage, time often seemed to stand still. If the aristocratic lady lived within the gilded cage of ancestral estates and glittering London ballrooms, the middle-class woman of Victorian Britain inhabited a different but equally constraining sphere, one forged in the crucible of industrial capitalism and moral reform. By the mid-19th century, Britain's middle class had expanded dramatically, nourished by commerce, banking, manufacturing and the professions. With it came a new ideology of domesticity, one that exalted the home as a moral refuge from the tumult of industrial life and placed the woman firmly at its centre. This vision of domestic womanhood was crystallised in the ideal of the angel of the house, a phrase immortalised by Coventry Patmore's sentimental poem of 1854. Though originally written in praise of his wife, the concept soon took on a broader cultural meaning. The middle-class woman was to embody purity, self-sacrifice and obedience, a spiritual guardian who maintained the moral order of the household. She was not expected to labour in the world of commerce or politics. Rather, her task was to shape the character of her husband and children, ensuring that the home stood as a sanctuary in a turbulent society. The angel's wings, however, were bound by expectation, and her halo came at the cost of autonomy. A middle-class household of the 1840s or 1850s was smaller than the palaces of the aristocracy, but often no less concerned with appearances. A successful solicitor, doctor or merchant might own a comfortable townhouse or suburban villa, its architecture designed to signal respectability. Inside, the wife presided over drawing rooms decorated with heavy drapery, polished mahogany, and carefully displayed ornaments, porcelain figurines, family portraits, and the ever-present Bible. These objects were not merely aesthetic, they testified to the family's adherence to order, refinement and piety. The woman's duty was to curate this environment, for the home was the visible expression of her virtue. Her daily routine reflected this moral mission. Morning might begin with household accounts, for though her husband earned the income, she managed the expenditures on food, clothing and servants. Middle-class families often employed at least one maid-of-all-work whose duties ranged from scrubbing floors to carrying coal, and the mistress was expected to supervise her closely. The house was both workplace and symbol, and a woman's diligence, or failure, was evident in every polished teapot and swept hearth. After domestic matters were settled, she might turn to her children, overseeing lessons conducted by governesses or instructing them herself in reading, sewing and religious devotion. Afternoons could be devoted to needlework, charitable visits or calls upon friends, while evenings brought family prayers, Bible readings or occasional outings to lectures or concerts. The emphasis on morality was intense. Middle-class women were regarded as the custodians of Christian virtue, and their reputations were guarded with vigilance. A single indiscretion, an unchaperoned meeting, an overly bold comment could tarnish a woman's standing and, by extension, her family's respectability. Courtship was carefully monitored, with young women expected to demonstrate modesty, restraint, and obedience. Marriage, when it came, was both a personal milestone and a social duty, uniting families within the intricate web of middle-class respectability. For a woman, to remain unmarried was to risk marginalisation. Spinsterhood carried with it the faint odour of failure. Education for middle-class girls was expanding but remained narrowly focused. The early decades of the century offered little beyond finishing schools, where accomplishments such as music, French and needlework were taught to enhance a girl's marriage prospects. By the 1860s and 1870s, however, a growing movement for women's education began to bear fruit. Schools founded by reformers like Frances Buss and Dorothea Beale introduced more rigorous curricula, including mathematics and science, while the first women's colleges at Oxford and Cambridge opened doors, albeit cautiously. Still, for most middle-class families, intellectual ambition in daughters was treated with suspicion, as though excessive study might damage femininity or hinder marital prospects. The angel of the house was expected to be cultured but not competitive, intelligent but not assertive. Motherhood was considered the pinnacle of a woman's duty. Middle-class wives often bore several children, though fewer than their working-class counterparts, thanks in part to the growing availability of contraceptive knowledge, albeit rarely discussed openly. Child-rearing manuals, widely published and eagerly consumed, instructed mothers in the virtues of discipline, morality and hygiene. Writers like Sarah Stickney Ellis insisted that the influence of the mother was the foundation of national character. If Britain was to remain great, its women must raise virtuous sons and dutiful daughters. Thus the home was framed not merely as a private refuge, but as the crucible of empire itself. Yet the angelic ideal was fraught with contradictions. While women were exalted as moral superiors, they were simultaneously denied civic equality. They could not vote, hold public office, or practice most professions. Married women, under coverture, had no independent legal identity, their property and earnings absorbed by their husbands. Even their philanthropy, though often extensive, was circumscribed by the language of duty and compassion, rather than recognised as civic leadership. In this sense, the ideology of separate spheres, the belief that men belonged to the public world and women to the private, was both a cage and a pedestal offering reverence without freedom. Some women chafed against these boundaries. Diaries and letters from the period reveal frustrations with endless domestic tasks, with intellectual stagnation, with the lack of meaningful outlets for ambition. The mid-Victorian decades saw the emergence of female writers who challenged the angelic ideal. Charlotte Bronte's heroines insisted on their right to self-respect and independence. Elizabeth Gaskell portrayed the struggles of women in industrial towns. George Eliot gave voice to women whose intellectual aspirations clashed with societal constraints. Their novels struck chords with readers precisely because they illuminated the dissonance between the prescribed ideal and lived reality. Philanthropy became one of the few legitimate avenues for middle-class women to step beyond their households. They organised temperance societies, visited the poor, taught in Sunday schools, and campaigned for improvements in sanitation and health. Such activities were justified as extensions of maternal care applied to the wider community. Yet in practice, they provided women with experience in organisation, fundraising and public speaking, skills that would later fuel the suffrage movement. What began as charity often evolved into advocacy, as women confronted the systemic injustices that charity alone could not remedy. Religion reinforced and sometimes softened these tensions. Evangelical Christianity, influential in Victorian culture, emphasised personal piety, family devotion, and social reform. Women were encouraged to see their domestic sacrifices as spiritual offerings, their patience and obedience as reflections of Christ-like humility. Yet the same faith also inspired some to activism, from campaigning against slavery to supporting missionary work abroad. In this paradox lay both the strength and the limitation of religious ideology. It sanctified submission but also legitimated service, and within that service, women found voices that could not easily be silenced. The material culture of middle-class homes further illustrates the weight of expectation. Manuals such as Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, first published in 1861, offered exhaustive guidance on everything from recipes to servant supervision, shaping a vision of the mistress as both moral guide and efficient manager. A woman was expected to embody domestic science, to harmonise comfort, cleanliness and economy. The polished surfaces of her parlour were not merely aesthetic choices, but moral statements. Order reflected virtue, disorder hinted at moral decay, every cushion fluffed, every rug aligned, every meal served on time was a silent testimony to the angel's invisible labour. Despite these pressures, many middle-class women took pride in their roles, finding meaning in the rhythm of household life and the bonds of family. Letters revealed genuine affection between husbands and wives, joy in children's milestones, and satisfaction in maintaining a respectable home. It would be a distortion to paint all as restless captives. For some, the angelic role aligned with personal desires and religious convictions. Yet the uniformity of the ideal left little room for variation, and those who did not fit, women who were intellectual, artistic, unmarried, or simply different, often struggled to find a place in this rigid framework. By the closing decades of the 19th century, the angel of the house was still invoked but increasingly questioned. Debates over women's property rights, education and suffrage exposed the contradictions of venerating women as moral guardians while denying them civic equality. The image of the self-sacrificing angel, serene and submissive, began to clash with the reality of women who were teaching, writing, reforming and organising. The cracks in the ideology were widening, though its cultural power remained immense. Thus the life of the middle-class Victorian woman was at once honoured and constrained, dignified and diminished. She bore the mantle of moral superiority but carried it within a cage of social expectation. Her parlour might gleam, her children might thrive, her reputation might shine, yet her autonomy was circumscribed by laws, customs and traditions that regarded her as dependent. In her world, the domestic sphere was both sanctuary and prison, a place where duty was exalted but freedom was denied. In this paradox, the story of Victorian womanhood deepens, from the aristocratic lady in her gilded mansion to the middle-class angel in her suburban villa. The contours of female life were etched by ideals that demanded sacrifice and obedience. Yet beneath these surfaces, questions stirred. Was virtue truly tied to silence? Was the highest calling of a woman always to serve others? Could the angel ever step beyond the threshold of her home without losing her wings? These questions would not be silenced forever. The middle-class woman of the mid-19th century could not yet imagine the full breadth of change to come, but in her quiet frustrations, her charitable labours, and her whispered doubts, she was already preparing the ground for transformation. If the angel of the middle-class home symbolised the purity and order of Victorian domesticity, the working-class woman embodied the raw endurance of industrial Britain. Her life was not shaped by the refined parlour or the moralising novel, but by the clang of machinery, the damp of cellar dwellings, and the ceaseless struggle to survive. While the aristocrat entertained in gilded drawing rooms and the middle-class wife curated domestic respectability, the working-class woman laboured in factories, workshops, and crowded kitchens, her body and spirit pressed to the limits by poverty and necessity. The Industrial Revolution, by the 19th century, had transformed Britain into the workshop of the world. Textile mills dominated the northern landscapes of Manchester, Leeds, and Glasgow, while coal mines and iron foundries fueled the engines of empire. Women were integral to this economy. In Lancashire's cotton mills, they constituted nearly half the workforce. In smaller trades such as lace-making, straw plaiting, or pottery, their presence was even greater. Official reports estimated that by mid-century more than a third of working-class women in industrial regions were employed outside the home, and many more engaged in informal labour such as laundry, piecework, sewing or street selling. Their labour was gruelling. In textile factories, shifts stretched from dawn until dusk, typically 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. Women stood amid deafening looms, inhaling cotton dust that settled into lungs and caused byssinosis, a chronic respiratory disease. The heat and humidity maintained to keep threads pliable left them drenched in sweat, while accidents, fingers caught in spindles, hair tangled in machinery, were commonplace. The factory inspectors' reports, submitted annually to Parliament, recorded grisly injuries and lamented the indifference of employers who valued productivity above safety. Yet for many families, the wages of women and children were indispensable. Without them, rent could not be paid, bread could not be bought, survival itself was precarious. Mothers often brought their children to the mills, for child labour was widespread until legislative reforms slowly curtailed it in the mid-19th century. Boys and girls as young as 8 worked as scavengers, crawling beneath moving machines to collect stray cotton, or as piecers, leaning across whirring frames to repair broken threads. The presence of women and children together underscored the familial nature of industrial labour. Entire households were absorbed into the factory system, their domestic rhythms subordinated to the relentless beat of industrial time. Even as later reforms reduced hours for children, women remained bound to the long working day, expected to balance wage labour with household duties. Housing for working-class families reflected their poverty. In industrial towns, rows of back-to-back terraces crammed families into 2 or 3 rooms, often without ventilation, drainage or running water. Cellar dwellings, damp and dark, were common for the poorest. Edwin Chadwick's 1842 report on the sanitary condition of the labouring population documented with grim detail the squalor of such environments, overflowing privies, contaminated wells, and the stench of refuse. Diseases such as cholera, typhus and tuberculosis spread rapidly in these conditions, and women bore the brunt of caregiving in the midst of their own exhaustion. Infant mortality rates were staggering. In some industrial towns, 1 child in 3 died before the age of 5. Domestic labour did not vanish when women returned from factories. it only compounded. After 12 or 14 hours of spinning or weaving, a woman might still cook meagre meals, mend clothing, fetch water from communal pumps, and care for children. Husbands, if employed in mines or heavy industry, were equally exhausted, and the strain on family life was immense. Alcohol often became a salve, fueling the growth of the gin shop and the public house, yet it also deepened domestic tensions. Contemporary observers, particularly middle-class reformers, were quick to castigate working-class men for drunkenness, while often overlooking the systemic conditions that made such escapism appealing. Women, in turn, shouldered the double burden of labour and moral responsibility, criticised if their homes were untidy or their children unruly, even when their lives allowed little respite. Yet, within this hardship, forms of resilience and solidarity emerged. Women played vital roles in neighbourhood networks, sharing childcare, lending food or money, and offering mutual aid in times of illness or unemployment. Female friendship sustained morale, as did communal activities such as attending chapel, participating in friendly societies, or gathering at washhouses. In some regions, women led informal economies, taking in lodgers, running small shops from their kitchens, or hawking goods in the streets. The survival of working-class communities depended not only on the wages brought home, but on the hidden labour of women in maintaining these fragile webs of support. The image of the working-class woman in Victorian culture was complex and often contradictory. Middle-class commentators alternately pitied her suffering and condemned her supposed immorality. Philanthropists founded missions and ragged schools to instruct poor women and children in cleanliness, piety and thrift, often with condescension. Literature portrayed her in sentimental or sensational terms. The tragic factory girl seduced and abandoned, the self-sacrificing mother wasting away in poverty, or the fallen woman reduced to prostitution. Each trope revealed more about middle-class anxieties than about the women themselves. Actual working-class women, in their letters and testimonies to parliamentary commissions, spoke with pragmatic clarity. They wanted shorter hours, fair wages, and healthier living conditions. Reform came slowly. The Factory Acts of the 1830s and 1840s limited the hours of women and children, eventually capping the working day at 10 hours for certain trades. Inspectors enforced regulations on ventilation and machine guarding, though employers frequently circumvented them. Critics debated whether such legislation protected women or restricted their economic independence, for reduced hours also meant reduced wages. Some male workers resented women's presence in factories, seeing them as competition, and trade unions often excluded them. Nevertheless, women organised in their own right. In the 1840s, female operatives in Lancashire petitioned Parliament for better conditions. In the 1870s, women formed trade unions in the textile and match industries, with figures such as Emma Patterson championing their cause. Though their victories were modest, they planted seeds for future labour activism. Domestic service, too, remained a major employer of working-class women. For those who could not or would not endure factory labour, service offered board and wages, albeit at the cost of long hours and subordination. A maid-of-all-work might rise before dawn to light fires and scrub floors, retiring only after her employers had gone to bed. Her life was one of isolation, caught between the world of her working-class family and the households of her middle-class employers. Turnover was high, as many young women left service upon marriage or sought factory jobs with slightly higher autonomy. Service, like factory labour, underscored the limited choices available to women of modest means. Marriage and motherhood, while cherished ideals, carried different realities for the working class. Many women continued to labour after marriage, especially if husbands' wages were insufficient. Childbearing was frequent, contraception unreliable, and maternal mortality high. The responsibilities of raising children in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions were daunting, yet many women took pride in their households, however humble. Accounts from social investigators note women scrubbing steps, sewing late into the night, and stretching meagre budgets to provide Sunday clothing for their children. Respectability was a prized aspiration, even amid poverty, and women strove to maintain it against daunting odds. The resilience of working-class women extended to cultural and political life. They attended chapel services, sang in choirs, and participated in community festivities. Some became active in radical politics, especially during the Chartist movement of the 1830s and 1840s, which demanded universal male suffrage, but also drew support from women. Petitions bore thousands of female signatures, and meetings often featured women speakers who linked the struggle for democracy to their own hardships. Though their contributions were frequently minimised in official accounts, they reveal a current of political consciousness that ran through the working-class female experience. By the later decades of the century, improvements in sanitation, housing and education began to alter working-class life, though unevenly. The Public Health Acts mandated sewers and clean water. School attendance became compulsory. Slum clearance projects reshaped urban landscapes. Yet poverty persisted, and women's labour remained essential. In the match factories of London, women faced phossy jaw, a disfiguring disease caused by phosphorus exposure. In sweated trades, such as tailoring and chain-making, piecework paid starvation wages. Journalists like Henry Mayhew and reformers like Annie Besant exposed these conditions, sparking public outrage. The plight of working-class women was increasingly visible, though rarely resolved. Thus, the life of the Victorian working-class woman was marked by relentless toil, physical strain, and social invisibility. She was the backbone of industrial Britain, yet her labour was undervalued, her body overworked, her voice marginalised. Her existence stood in stark contrast to the angel of the middle-class home, or the lady of aristocratic leisure. She was neither exalted nor adorned. She was expected to endure. Yet within her endurance lay a quiet strength, one that sustained families, communities, and industries. Her story, too often overshadowed, is indispensable to understanding the fabric of Victorian society. And so, as the narrative of Victorian womanhood unfolds, we see not a single figure but a spectrum. The aristocrat in her country estate, the middle-class angel in her suburban villa, and the working-class woman in her factory or cellar dwelling. Each lived under the shadow of expectation and constraint, yet each bore unique burdens and forged distinct paths. Together they reveal the paradox of a society that exalted womanhood as moral ideal while confining real women to narrow, exhausting roles. The working-class woman, with calloused hands and weary eyes, may not have graced the drawing rooms of polite society, but without her labour, the empire itself could not have stood. If factories and mills drew thousands of working-class women into the heart of industrial production, domestic service absorbed even more into the intimate spaces of middle and upper-class households. By the mid-19th century, domestic service was the single largest category of female employment in Britain. Census records of 1851 revealed that more than 1 in 3 women engaged in paid work did so as servants, a proportion that remained high throughout the century. The figure was so significant that commentators often remarked that Britain was a nation of servants, a reflection not only of social hierarchy, but of the sheer scale of this hidden workforce. Domestic servants were as essential to Victorian society as the coal that fueled its furnaces. They scrubbed the floors of suburban villas, polished the silver in aristocratic mansions, nursed children in nurseries, and carried coal scuttles up countless flights of stairs. Their presence allowed middle and upper-class households to maintain the standards of comfort and respectability that defined Victorian culture. Yet their lives were often lonely, their labour unceasing, and their identities invisible, for they existed to ensure the smooth running of other people's lives. The typical servant's day began before dawn. The maid-of-all-work, the lowest rung of domestic service and often the only servant in a modest household, rose in the dark to light fires, haul water and scrub the scullery. Her duties stretched across every corner of the home, cooking, cleaning, laundering and running errands. She might finish her tasks long after her employers had gone to bed, only to rise again before them the next morning. Middle-class employers frequently complained that maids were slovenly or disobedient, yet few acknowledged the sheer impossibility of their workload. It was said that a maid-of-all-work had no work, only all work. In larger households, labour was divided into a hierarchy of roles. The cook reigned over the kitchen, the housemaid maintained the bedrooms, the scullery maid cleaned pots, the footman waited at table, and the butler oversaw them all. For women, positions ranged from the lowly scullery maid, often a young girl of 14 or 15, to the senior housekeeper, a respected figure who managed accounts and staff. Governesses, though not strictly servants, occupied an ambiguous position. educated enough to teach children French and piano, yet socially isolated, belonging neither to the family nor to the servant hall. The rigid gradations of domestic service mirrored the wider class structure of Victorian Britain, with status carefully measured by duties, uniforms, and privileges. Privacy was scarce for servants. They often slept in attics, basements, or cramped quarters, with little comfort beyond a straw mattress. Meals were taken hastily in the servants' hall, and leisure was rare. Living in was the norm, binding servants physically and socially to the households they served. Their employers controlled not only their labour but also their movements and morality. References were crucial for securing future positions, and a poor character report could doom a servant's career. Thus, obedience, discretion, and perceived virtue were demanded alongside skill. A servant who was suspected of dishonesty, impertinence, or immorality risked dismissal without notice. The relationship between mistress and servant was fraught with tension. Middle-class women, themselves confined to the domestic sphere, often exerted authority over their female servants as a form of empowerment. Manuals such as Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management provided extensive advice on supervising servants, emphasizing discipline, fairness, and vigilance. Employers prided themselves on being benevolent, yet letters and diaries reveal frequent frustrations. Servants were accused of being wasteful with food, careless with china, or insolent in tone. Servants, for their part, described mistresses as capricious, demanding, and hypocritical. The intimacy of service, sharing households, overhearing conversations, witnessing private lives, only heightened these frictions. Wages for servants were meagre. A maid-of-all-work might earn £8 to £12 per year, often paid partly in clothing rather than cash. Higher-ranking servants fared better, with cooks or housekeepers earning £20 to £40 annually, but wages rarely matched the effort required. Yet service did provide room and board, which for many rural migrants represented security compared to uncertain factory employment. Girls from the countryside often entered service in their teens, sent by families who valued the remittances they could send home. For many, domestic service was a temporary stage before marriage, though some remained lifelong servants, particularly if unmarried or lacking dowries. Moral scrutiny weighed heavily on female servants. Employers demanded chastity and sobriety, fearing the disruption that scandal could bring to their households. Pregnant servants were often dismissed without references, leaving them vulnerable to destitution or prostitution. Servant placement agencies, which matched women with employers, acted as gatekeepers of reputation, and gossip circulated rapidly through networks of mistresses. The servant's body was thus policed as rigorously as her labour, a reflection of broader Victorian anxieties about female sexuality and class discipline. Despite the hardships, servants carved out spaces of community and resistance. On rare afternoons off, they visited family, walked in parks, or attended chapel services. Friendships formed within servant halls, where jokes, gossip, and camaraderie lightened the monotony. Popular culture catered to their tastes. Cheap novels, serialized magazines, and penny theatres provided escape. Ballads and songs circulated among servant communities, offering both amusement and subtle commentary on their employers' foibles. Instances of petty resistance, slow work, feigned illness, discreet borrowing of food hinted at servants' agency within systems that demanded silence and obedience. The figure of the servant loomed large in Victorian literature and imagination. Novelists often used servants as confidants, comic relief, or moral exemplars. In Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, the kindly housekeeper Mrs. Fairfax provides companionship to the governess. In Dickens's novels, faithful servants often embody loyalty and honesty. Yet reality was more complex. Servants were neither saints nor caricatures, but individuals navigating precarious positions, balancing duty with survival, and often harbouring ambitions beyond the scullery. The servant problem, so Victorians called the persistent tension between supply, demand, and discipline in domestic service, became a topic of endless debate. Middle-class households complained of a shortage of reliable servants, even as thousands of women sought work. The problem was less of scarcity than of expectation. Young women increasingly preferred factory jobs, where wages were higher and autonomy greater, even if conditions were harsh. By the late 19th century, middle-class commentators lamented the decline of domestic service, interpreting it as a symptom of social disorder and the erosion of traditional hierarchies. Reformers attempted to improve the lot of servants through training schools and moral societies. Institutions taught girls cookery, laundry, and needlework, aiming to produce efficient and obedient workers. Religious organisations emphasised piety and thrift, presenting service as a noble calling. Yet such initiatives rarely addressed the fundamental inequalities of the system. Servants remained bound by dependence on employers' goodwill, with little opportunity for advancement or independence. Still, domestic service was not without its rewards. For some women, it provided stability, opportunities to learn skills, and even chances to travel when accompanying employers. Housekeepers and cooks in wealthy households could wield significant authority, commanding respect from both employers and junior staff. Anecdotes abound of servants who saved wages to establish small businesses, marry respectably, or support aging parents. Their contributions, though hidden behind curtains and beneath stairs, underpin the very fabric of Victorian domestic life. The paradox of domestic service mirrors the paradox of Victorian womanhood itself. It elevated the home as the moral heart of the nation, yet relied on the invisible labour of women whose own homes were sacrificed to maintain it. It celebrated female virtue and discipline, yet subjected servants to endless suspicion and control. It promised stability, yet offered little freedom. Servants lived in the shadows of their employers' lives, their labour indispensable but their voices scarcely heard. By situating the servant alongside the aristocratic lady, the middle-class angel, and the factory worker, we perceive the spectrum of Victorian female experience. Each was confined by expectations, though in different forms. The servant, perhaps more than any other, embodied the contradictions of the age, present in every household yet rarely acknowledged, essential to the comfort of others yet denied comfort herself. In her story, the hidden scaffolding of Victorian society comes into view, revealing how the lives of women, in every class and role, sustained an empire built upon both visible and invisible toil. The clothing of Victorian women was not merely a matter of fabric and ornament, it was a visible symbol of class, morality and identity. Fashion in the 19th century served as a language through which society articulated values and hierarchies. To dress in the Victorian age was to participate in an intricate dialogue between tradition and innovation, propriety and allure, health and discomfort. Each gown, corset and bonnet bore the weight of cultural meaning, reflecting the shifting ideals of femininity in an era marked by industrial progress and moral rigidity. By the 1840s, women's dress was defined by voluminous skirts supported by layers of petticoats, tight corseted waists, and modest bodices. Silk, taffeta, and cotton fabrics were adorned with lace and ribbon, while accessories such as gloves, shawls, and parasols completed the ensemble. The silhouette itself conveyed a message. A narrow waist suggested discipline and delicacy, while the sweeping skirt projected status by occupying physical space. Clothing thus became an index of class, for only those who could afford servants to launder and maintain such garments could wear them daily. The introduction of the crinoline in the 1850s transformed fashion dramatically. Constructed from steel hoops, the crinoline allowed skirts to reach unprecedented widths without the weight of endless petticoats. Satirical magazines like Punch mocked the contraption, illustrating women unable to fit through doorways or tipping over in gusts of wind. Yet crinolines were embraced widely, not only by aristocratic women but also by the aspiring middle class, who saw them as a mark of refinement. The crinoline exemplified the paradox of Victorian fashion, innovation born of industrial technology that simultaneously reinforced traditional ideals of feminine delicacy and impracticality. Corsetry, too, was central to the Victorian wardrobe. Advertisements promised health corsets and hygienic stays, though in practice corsets constricted the body, compressing the ribs and organs to achieve the prized hourglass shape. Physicians warned of tight lacing and its consequences, fainting, indigestion, even deformity of the spine, yet the corset persisted, defended as a support for posture and morality. The corset was not simply an instrument of vanity, it was a symbol of self-control, a visible demonstration of discipline in an age obsessed with bodily restraint. To be properly laced was to be respectable, while looseness, literal or figurative, suggested moral laxity. Fashion evolved with the decades. By the 1870s, the crinoline gave way to the bustle, a padded framework that projected skirts backward, creating a pronounced silhouette. Dresses became more tailored with elaborate drapery, pleats and trimmings. The aesthetic movement of the 1880s challenged conventional fashion, promoting looser gowns inspired by medieval and classical styles, yet such garments remained the preserve of artistic circles. Mainstream Victorian fashion continued to prize modesty, structure and ornament, reflecting the enduring authority of social codes over personal comfort. Clothing was also a means of moral distinction. Manuals on female conduct emphasized the importance of dressing appropriately to one's station and occasion. Modesty required covered shoulders, long sleeves and high necklines, particularly for day wear. Bright colours and extravagant styles risked associations with actresses or courtesans, whose dress blurred the lines between fashion and immorality. For working-class women, simpler dresses and durable fabrics signalled thrift and respectability, though these garments lacked the ornamentation of wealth. Even within limited means, women sought to emulate prevailing styles, adapting patterns with cheaper materials. Second-hand clothing markets thrived, sustaining a trade that blurred class distinctions, while revealing the economic realities underpinning fashion. Hygiene posed significant challenges in maintaining Victorian wardrobes. Garments were heavy, layered and difficult to wash. Laundering was labour-intensive, involving boiling water, lye soap, and hours of scrubbing and drying. Servants bore the brunt of this labour, often damaging delicate fabrics in the process. To reduce washing, women wore chemises and petticoats beneath gowns, which absorbed sweat and protected outer fabrics. Gloves and collars were detachable, allowing for easier cleaning. Despite these precautions, odours and soiling were constant concerns, particularly in crowded urban environments where coal smoke, dust and industrial grime clung to clothing. Personal hygiene, too, reflected broader cultural anxieties. Daily bathing was rare for most Victorians, constrained by limited access to running water and the labour of heating large quantities of it. Middle and upper-class households might possess hip baths or portable tubs, but even there, full immersion was infrequent. Instead, women washed selectively with basins and sponges, focusing on visible areas such as the face and hands. Hair care involved brushing with boar bristle brushes and occasional washing with soap or vinegar rinses. Elaborate hairstyles, often supplemented with false hairpieces, concealed the difficulties of cleanliness while projecting an image of refinement. The regulation of bodily hygiene carried moral significance. Dirt was associated with disorder and immorality, while cleanliness was linked to virtue. Campaigns for sanitary reform emphasized the dangers of filth not only for health, but for morality, particularly in urban slums. Middle-class women, cast as guardians of cleanliness, bore responsibility for ensuring that their households embodied these values. In practice, however, the elaborate demands of fashion often conflicted with the ideals of hygiene. Layers of tightly laced clothing restricted circulation, hampered movement, and trapped heat, creating conditions ripe for illness even as they projected respectability. The fashion industry itself was transformed by industrialization. Advances in textile manufacturing, dye chemistry and sewing machines revolutionized the production and distribution of clothing. Synthetic dyes introduced in the 1850s expanded the palette of fashion, producing vivid colours such as mauve and magenta. Department stores such as Harrods in London offered ready-made garments alongside fabrics and accessories, catering to an expanding consumer market. Fashion periodicals like the Englishwoman's Domestic magazine disseminated patterns and advice, allowing women across Britain to participate in the culture of fashion even at modest incomes. The democratisation of style, however, did not dissolve class distinctions. Instead, it intensified competition to display respectability through dress. Hygiene concerns extended beyond clothing to the broader body politic of fashion. Critics condemned the use of arsenic in green dyes, which poisoned both the workers who produced fabrics and the women who wore them. Feathered hats and fur-trimmed garments fueled debates over animal cruelty and extravagance. Reformers promoted rational dress, advocating looser garments and the abandonment of corsets, particularly for health and mobility. The Rational Dress Society, founded in 1881, argued that fashion should not endanger women's bodies. Yet their efforts met resistance. for mainstream culture continued to equate feminine beauty with constraint and ornament. Working-class women faced different realities. Factory workers and servants required practical clothing that could withstand labour, yet they too participated in fashion to the extent possible. Sunday best, special dresses reserved for church and outings, allowed working women to display dignity and respectability despite modest means. The contrast between weekday practicality and Sunday display underscored the dual pressures of survival and social aspiration. For many, clothing was the most visible marker of upward mobility, even if it meant sacrifices in other areas of life. Fashion also intersected with life stages. Girls wore simpler frocks until adolescence, when corsetry and long skirts initiated them into womanhood. Married women adopted more elaborate styles, signifying maturity and social position, while widows adhered to strict codes of mourning dress, often for years. Mourning attire, typically black crepe, served as both a personal expression of grief and a public signal of virtue and piety. Queen Victoria herself, who wore mourning for Prince Albert from 1861 until her death in 1901, set a powerful precedent that shaped cultural expectations of widowhood. Through fashion and hygiene, Victorian women navigated the tension between individual expression and societal control. Clothing restricted movement but also provided opportunities for display and self-presentation. Hygiene emphasized morality, yet revealed the practical challenges of maintaining purity in an industrial urban age. Together, these practices constructed a visible identity for women, binding them to the ideals of respectability, even as they endured discomfort and constraint. The wardrobe of the Victorian woman thus becomes more than a collection of garments. It is a document of history, inscribed with threads of industry, morality, class and gender. Each corset, crinoline and bonnet reveals the ways in which women's bodies were shaped, displayed and disciplined. Hygiene rituals, from brushing hair to laundering chemises, expose the labour and anxiety behind the polished image of femininity. In understanding Victorian fashion, we glimpse the deeper structures of a society that valued order, display and discipline, yet could not reconcile these ideals with the human needs of comfort, health and freedom. Education in the Victorian age was both a promise and a boundary for women. To teach a woman to read, to write and to think was to grant her entry into a world of ideas, but also to awaken anxieties about her place within society. While the century witnessed unprecedented advances in literacy and intellectual opportunity, it also reinforced the conviction that female education must serve, rather than challenge, the ideals of domesticity and moral virtue. The result was a paradox. Women were increasingly literate and engaged in public debates, yet continually reminded that their highest vocation remained within the home. At the beginning of Queen Victoria's reign in 1837, female education was uneven and class-bound. For middle and upper-class girls, schooling often took place at home under the supervision of governesses. These governesses, themselves educated yet socially precarious, instructed young ladies in French, music, drawing and the accomplishments that would make them suitable wives. Academic subjects such as mathematics or classical languages were rarely emphasized, lest they produce learned women deemed unfeminine. Conduct manuals warned against overtaxing the female brain, insisting that intellectual exertion could damage a woman's health and reproductive capacity. Working-class girls, by contrast, often received little or no formal education in the early decades of the century. Their lives were shaped by labour in factories, domestic service or agriculture. Literacy rates among working women lagged behind men, reflecting both economic necessity and cultural indifference. Sunday schools and charitable institutions offered rudimentary instruction in reading and scripture, but opportunities were scarce. A girl's education was expected to prepare her for obedience, thrift and piety, rather than intellectual achievement. The mid-century, however, brought significant reforms. The spread of public schooling, particularly after the Education Act of 1870, expanded access to basic literacy for boys and girls alike. Elementary schools taught reading, writing, arithmetic and religious instruction, though girls were often directed towards sewing and domestic skills as well. Inspectors' reports revealed a persistent gender divide. Boys excelled in mathematics and geography, while girls were praised for neat handwriting and needlework. The curriculum itself reflected societal expectations. reinforcing the belief that women's minds should be trained for order and morality, not independence. Despite these constraints, intellectual opportunities for women grew in unexpected ways. The explosion of print culture, newspapers, magazines, serialized novels, and inexpensive books meant that women became avid readers and increasingly writers. Circulating libraries offered access to literature, while magazines such as the Englishwoman's Domestic Magazine or the Cornhill Magazine cultivated female audiences. Reading became both a pastime and a moral exercise, shaping women's engagement with fiction, poetry, and political debate. Critics worried that novels might inflame female imaginations, leading to discontent with domestic roles, yet publishers recognized the economic power of female readership and catered to it. Higher education for women advanced cautiously but significantly. The 1840s and 1850s saw the establishment of pioneering institutions such as Queen's College, 1848, and Bedford College, 1849, in London, offering instruction to women beyond the accomplishments. By the 1860s and 1870s, women's colleges affiliated with Oxford and Cambridge, Girton, Newnham, Somerville, and Lady Margaret Hall opened their doors, though women were not granted full degrees until decades later. The struggle for academic recognition reflected broader debates about gender and intellect. Advocates such as Emily Davies and Josephine Butler argued that intellectual equality was essential for justice, while opponents warned that rigorous study would unsex women, rendering them unfit for marriage and motherhood. The presence of women in intellectual circles sparked controversy, but also creativity. The mid-Victorian period produced a remarkable cohort of female writers, poets, and thinkers. Novelists such as Charlotte Bronte, Elizabeth Gaskell, and George Eliot explored the inner lives of women with unprecedented psychological depth. Their works confronted the limitations of education, marriage, and society, often drawing from personal experiences of intellectual isolation. Florence Nightingale, remembered for her nursing reforms, was also a formidable statistician and writer who criticised the wasted potential of educated women denied meaningful employment. The role of reading societies, debating clubs, and lectures further expanded intellectual horizons. Middle-class women participated in mechanics institutes, literary societies, and church-based discussion groups. Philanthropic and reform organisations provided outlets for educated women to apply their knowledge to social causes, from temperance campaigns to the abolition of slavery. While direct entry into politics or universities remained restricted, intellectual engagement flourished in semi-private spaces that blurred the line between domesticity and public life. Scientific education posed particular challenges. While botany was considered a suitable pursuit for women aligned with the virtues of observation and refinement, subjects such as chemistry, geology, or medicine were deemed inappropriate. Women who pursued scientific study often did so informally, through correspondence, popular science lectures, or private laboratories. Mary Somerville, whose mathematical and astronomical works gained international respect, exemplified both the possibilities and the obstacles of female scholarship. She was hailed as the Queen of Science, yet constantly depicted as an exception rather than evidence of broader female potential. For working-class women, intellectual life often intersected with radical politics. Chartist women, trade unionists, and later suffragists recognized the power of literacy and oratory as tools of resistance. Working-class memoirs and testimonies reveal the importance of reading newspapers, pamphlets, and novels in shaping consciousness and solidarity. Education was not only a matter of personal improvement, but of collective empowerment, challenging the structures that confined women to labour and silence. Religious instruction remained central to Victorian education, and women were expected to absorb moral lessons as part of their intellectual formation. The Bible was both a text of devotion and a field of interpretation, with women writers producing religious commentaries, tracts, and hymns. Evangelical movements emphasized female piety, casting educated women as moral guides for their families. Yet this emphasis could be double-edged. While it legitimized female literacy, it also reinforced the notion that women's intellect was subordinate to spiritual, rather than secular, ends. The tension between opportunity and restraint defined the intellectual lives of Victorian women. They were invited to learn, but not to compete, encouraged to read, but not to question too boldly, permitted to write, but often under pseudonyms. George Eliot, born Mary Ann Evans, adopted a male pen name to ensure her works would be taken seriously. Charlotte Bronte initially published as Currer Bell. Their choices reflect the barriers to recognition that persisted despite their talent. By the final decades of the century, change was accelerating. Women began to pass university examinations, lecture publicly, and contribute to professional journals. The campaigns for women's suffrage and legal reform were led by articulate women who drew on educational gains to argue for equality. Intellectual life thus became a foundation for activism, demonstrating that knowledge could not be contained within the walls of the domestic parlour. Yet even as progress unfolded, contradictions remained. A girl educated in literature and science might still be expected to abandon intellectual pursuits upon marriage. A governess, equipped with skills, might find herself isolated and underpaid. The majority of working-class women, though literate, continued to labour long hours that left little time for intellectual development. The promise of education was unevenly distributed, its fruits harvested most fully by those with class advantages. Nevertheless, the intellectual awakening of women in the Victorian era was profound. It reshaped literature, philanthropy, science and politics, leaving legacies that extended far beyond the century. The determination of women to learn, to write and to think challenged entrenched assumptions and prepared the ground for future reforms. If their minds were confined by social expectations, they nevertheless expanded the boundaries of possibility, transforming both themselves and the society that sought to limit them. Marriage in the Victorian age was not only a private union of affection, but also a public institution freighted with legal, economic, and moral significance. It was the cornerstone of the domestic ideal that shaped Victorian culture, defining gender roles, inheritance, and the very structure of society. To understand marriage in the 19th century is to grasp the contradictions of an era that celebrated love while binding it to property, sanctified the family while subordinating women within it, and exalted chastity even as it confronted the realities of desire. At the heart of Victorian marriage was the doctrine of coverture. In legal terms, a wife's identity was absorbed into her husband's upon marriage. She could not own property independently, enter contracts, or retain custody of her children. William Blackstone's 18th century maxim that the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage still resonated in Victorian jurisprudence. Married women were thus legally invisible, their rights mediated through their husbands. Reforms such as the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 gradually granted women the right to own and control property, but for much of the century, the institution of marriage was inseparable from female dependency. Courtship practices reflected both romantic ideals and social pragmatism. Novels and etiquette manuals depicted courtship as a dance of sentiment, conducted under the watchful eyes of chaperones. Love letters, carefully preserved, blended declarations of affection with considerations of financial stability. Marriage was expected to unite not only hearts, but families and fortunes, particularly among the middle and upper classes. Respectability demanded that matches be prudent, ensuring the preservation of status and property. Romantic love was celebrated in poetry and fiction, yet in practice, calculation and convention often determined unions. The wedding ceremony itself was infused with symbolism. White dresses, popularised by Queen Victoria's 1840 marriage to Prince Albert, became the emblem of purity and innocence. The church service solemnised the union as sacred, with vows emphasising the wife's duty to obey her husband. Guests, gifts and celebrations varied by class, but across society marriage marked the transition from maidenhood to womanhood. For women, this transition carried immense social weight. A married woman was respectable, a spinster pitiable, and a widow bound by codes of mourning. Within the home, marriage structured daily life. The husband was legally and culturally recognised as head of the household, responsible for financial provision and authority. The wife, cast as the angel in the house, was expected to embody devotion, patience and selflessness. Middle-class manuals extolled the virtues of domestic harmony, urging women to submit cheerfully to their husbands' wills. The family was idealised as a sanctuary of moral order, yet beneath this ideal lay tensions of power, labour and desire. Sexuality, though shrouded in reticence, was an undeniable aspect of marriage. Victorian culture outwardly celebrated chastity, associating female virtue with sexual restraint. Yet medical, religious and legal discourses betrayed deep anxieties about sexual conduct. Doctors debated the dangers of excessive sexual activity, warning that it could sap male vitality and damage female health. At the same time, physicians pathologized female desire, often insisting that women were naturally passionless. This view reinforced the notion that women's sexuality existed solely for procreation, not pleasure. Nevertheless, evidence from diaries, court cases and popular literature reveals that desire was very much a reality within Victorian marriages. Women sought intimacy and affection, sometimes challenging the stereotype of passivity. The clandestine circulation of erotic literature, as well as the popularity of novels exploring forbidden love, suggests that Victorian society was more complex than its moral facade. The double standard was stark. Men's sexual transgressions were often tolerated or excused, while women who strayed faced ruin, ostracism or confinement in asylums. Marital breakdown exposed the limits of Victorian ideals. Divorce was legalised in England in 1857 with the Matrimonial Causes Act, but access remained highly unequal. Men could seek divorce on grounds of adultery alone, while women had to prove adultery compounded by cruelty, desertion or incest. The stigma of divorce was immense, particularly for women, who risked losing custody of children and forfeiting financial security. Cases reported in newspapers captivated public attention, exposing the gap between the ideal of harmonious marriage and the reality of abuse, neglect or incompatibility. For working-class families, marriage took on different contours. Economic necessity often dictated unions, with both husband and wife contributing labour to sustain the household. Women's wages, whether earned in factories, workshops or as laundresses, were critical to survival, though husbands were culturally positioned as breadwinners. The intimacy of working-class families was shaped by cramped housing, limited resources and high infant mortality. Yet testimonies and memoirs reveal bonds of affection, humour and resilience that defied stereotypes of degradation. Marriage in these contexts was less about respectability and more about endurance in the face of hardship. Sexual morality extended beyond marriage, shaping attitudes toward prostitution, illegitimacy and reproductive control. Prostitution was labelled the great social evil of Victorian society, its existence simultaneously condemned and tolerated. The Contagious Diseases Acts of the 1860s authorised police to detain and medically examine suspected prostitutes in garrison towns, subjecting women to invasive procedures while leaving male clients unpunished. Feminist reformers such as Josephine Butler campaigned fiercely against the acts, denouncing them as state-sanctioned violation of women's bodies. Their activism revealed how issues of sexuality and marriage intersected with broader struggles for justice and equality. Reproductive knowledge was limited and often shrouded in taboo. Contraceptive methods, such as withdrawal, condoms or pessaries, were available but stigmatised, associated with immorality or quackery. Large families were common, though high rates of infant mortality tempered expectations. Some reformers advocated for birth control as a means of improving women's health and alleviating poverty, but opposition from church and state was fierce. Within marriage, women bore the physical and emotional burdens of repeated pregnancies, often at great cost to their health. Despite constraints, marriage could also be a site of companionship and partnership. Letters between spouses reveal affection, humour, and shared intellectual interests. Queen Victoria's correspondence with Albert demonstrates a union of both passion and political collaboration, challenging simplistic views of male dominance and female passivity. Middle and working-class couples alike sometimes forged bonds of mutual support, negotiating roles in ways that departed from rigid prescriptions. The lived reality of marriage, as with all Victorian institutions, was more varied than the ideals proclaimed. By the late 19th century, shifting cultural currents began to reshape conceptions of marriage and sexuality. The women's rights movement challenged coverture and demanded reforms in divorce, custody and property laws. Scientific debates on sex and psychology, led by figures such as Havelock Ellis, questioned assumptions about female desire and chastity. Literature, from Thomas Hardy's tragic heroines to the daring New Woman novels of the 1890s, exposed the costs of restrictive marital ideals and imagined alternative futures. The Victorian marriage thus embodied both stability and strain. It upheld social order while concealing inequities. It sanctified love while enforcing discipline. It idealized chastity while grappling with desire. For women, marriage could be a shelter or a prison, a source of respectability or of erasure. In its contradictions, we glimpse the deeper paradox of the Victorian age, an era devoted to order yet riven by the very human complexities it sought to contain. In the panorama of the Victorian age, perhaps no development better reveals the tensions of modernity than the awakening of women's political consciousness. While Queen Victoria herself famously declared her distaste for women's rights agitation, millions of women across Britain were gradually drawn into questions of justice, citizenship and reform. Their activism did not begin with the right to vote. It encompassed education, property, labour and bodily autonomy, but suffrage would come to symbolise the broader struggle. At the dawn of the 19th century, women had virtually no political standing. They could not vote, hold office or sit on juries. Legal doctrine subsumed wives' rights into their husbands, and even unmarried women faced severe restrictions. Yet the Industrial Revolution, urbanisation, and the spread of literacy created conditions in which women could no longer remain politically invisible. New opportunities for employment, education, and public discourse exposed inequities that were increasingly difficult to ignore. The first organised demands for women's legal rights arose in the 1830s and 1840s. Chartism, the mass working-class movement for political reform, attracted female supporters who campaigned for universal suffrage, labour protections and education. Though male leaders often sidelined them, Chartist women held meetings, signed petitions and published essays linking their struggles to those of their male comrades. Their efforts anticipated later feminist campaigns by insisting that democracy without women was incomplete. Legal reform became an early battleground. The notorious inequities of divorce law, property rights and child custody galvanised women into action. Caroline Norton, whose personal experiences of marital abuse and legal dispossession became public in the 1830s, wrote impassioned pamphlets exposing the injustice of coverture. Her advocacy contributed to the Custody of Infants Act, 1839, and later reforms demonstrating the power of women's testimony to reshape law. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882, which allowed wives to retain earnings and property, marked significant though partial victories, achieved through persistent lobbying by female reformers. Education, too, became a political issue. The campaigns of Emily Davies, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, and others for women's access to universities and professional training were not merely intellectual pursuits, they were challenges to a system that defined citizenship through male privilege. Each lecture delivered, each examination passed, was a statement of capacity and entitlement, undermining arguments that women were unfit for public responsibility. The suffrage movement proper began to crystallise in the mid-19th century. In 1866, a petition signed by over 1,500 women, including Barbara Bodichon, Emily Davies and Elizabeth Garrett, was presented to Parliament, demanding the extension of the vote to women. Though rejected, it ignited a campaign that would span decades. The following year, John Stuart Mill, philosopher and reformer, introduced an amendment to the Reform Bill proposing women's suffrage. It was defeated, but the debate marked a turning point, legitimising the claim as part of mainstream political discourse. The formation of suffrage societies in the 1860s and 1870s institutionalised the movement. The London National Society for Women's Suffrage, led by Lydia Becker, organised petitions, pamphlets and lectures. Similar societies emerged in Manchester, Edinburgh and beyond, forming a national network. These organisations were dominated by middle-class women, whose education and resources enabled them to sustain campaigns, but they also attracted working-class supporters, especially in industrial regions. Activism expanded beyond the ballot. The campaign against the Contagious Diseases Acts in the 1870s, led by Josephine Butler, demonstrated the moral and political force of women's voices. Butler denounced the acts, which subjected suspected prostitutes to invasive medical examinations, a state-sponsored violation. Her crusade brought together women across class lines, uniting them in defence of bodily integrity and justice. The movement revealed that women could mobilise public opinion, confront Parliament, and achieve repeal, an achievement as significant as any suffrage victory. Opposition to women's political participation was fierce. Critics argued that women lacked the intellect, independence, or temperament for politics. They warned that suffrage would undermine the family, unsex women, and destabilise society. Satirical cartoons depicted suffragists as masculine, shrill, or neglectful mothers. Queen Victoria herself dismissed the cause as mad, wicked folly. Yet such opposition often betrayed anxiety rather than confidence, revealing fears that the inclusion of women might unsettle established hierarchies. Within the movement, divisions emerged. Some suffragists pursued gradual reform through petitions and persuasion, emphasising women's moral influence and domestic virtues. Others, particularly in the later decades, grew impatient with incremental progress. By the 1890s, the more militant tactics associated with the new woman were foreshadowed, though full militancy would arrive only in the Edwardian era. Still, the debates of the Victorian suffrage movement laid the groundwork for future radicalism, articulating strategies and arguments that would be inherited by their successors. The suffrage campaign was intertwined with broader questions of citizenship. Women sought entry into professions, participation in local government, and recognition as guardians of public morality. The Local Government Act of 1894 granted women ratepayers the right to vote in parish and district elections, a modest yet symbolically important breakthrough. School boards, poor law boards, and municipal offices became arenas in which women could exercise civic responsibility, challenging the notion that politics was exclusively male terrain. Print culture amplified the movement's reach. Journals such as the Englishwoman's Review and Women's Suffrage Journal disseminated arguments, reported on meetings, and forged networks across regions. Pamphlets articulated principles of equality, while novels and plays dramatised the injustices of female exclusion. Literature became a weapon, shaping public sentiment as much as parliamentary debate. The role of men in the movement was complex. Reformers like John Stuart Mill and Henry Fawcett lent support, but suffragists often emphasised women's independence, wary of being overshadowed. Male allies could amplify arguments in Parliament, yet the persistence of women's own organisations underscored the determination to define the cause on female terms. For working-class women, the suffrage struggle intersected with economic survival. Trade unions, cooperative societies and socialist groups increasingly recognised the necessity of including women, though not without tension. Women activists argued that political rights were inseparable from labour rights. To be a citizen meant not only to vote but to demand fair wages, safe conditions and dignity at work. The convergence of suffrage with socialism and labour politics in the 1880s and 1890s broadened the movement's base, connecting it to struggles beyond the parlour and lecture hall. By the close of the Victorian age, women had not yet won the parliamentary vote. That victory would come only in the 20th century, after sustained militancy and the upheavals of war. Yet the Victorian suffrage movement achieved profound transformations. It reshaped public discourse, legitimised women's political agency, and secured incremental reforms that eroded the foundations of exclusion. It fostered a generation of women experienced in organising, debating and leading, a generation that would carry the struggle forward. The legacy of these campaigns lies not only in the eventual enfranchisement of women but in the broader redefinition of citizenship. By demanding recognition, Victorian women exposed the contradictions of a society that proclaimed liberty while denying half its population a voice. Their petitions, speeches and protests reverberate as evidence that the pursuit of justice is never granted, but won through persistence. In their struggle, we perceive both the limits of Victorian patriarchy and the seeds of modern democracy. In the cultural landscape of Victorian Britain, women were both creators and creations, at once agents shaping literature, art and music, and figures moulded by cultural ideals that defined femininity. The period between 1837 and 1901 witnessed an unprecedented expansion of publishing, education and artistic institutions, which created opportunities for women to participate in intellectual life. Yet, as in politics and law, these opportunities were shadowed by restrictions, prejudice and contradictions. the Victorian woman was celebrated as a muse, condemned as a temptress, and, slowly, insistently, recognised as an author, painter and performer in her own right. Literature was the most significant arena for women's cultural influence. The expansion of circulating libraries and periodicals in the early 19th century provided new markets for fiction, essays and poetry. Women were among the most popular authors of the age, though they often wrote under male pseudonyms to navigate prejudice. Charlotte, Emily and Anne Bronte published their early works as Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell. Fearing dismissal as lady novelists, George Eliot, Mary Ann Evans chose a masculine pen name to ensure her novels were taken seriously. Their works, however, were not merely accepted, they transformed English literature, introducing psychological depth, social critique and new forms of narrative. The Victorian novel itself became feminised in both production and consumption. Women wrote prolifically, and women comprised the majority of readers. Novelists such as Elizabeth Gaskell, Margaret Oliphant and Dinah Crake explored domestic life, industrial society and moral dilemmas, balancing entertainment with social commentary. Gaskell's Mary Barton, 1848, brought working-class struggles into middle-class parlours, while her North and South, 1855, dramatised the conflict between industry and conscience, embedding female perspectives in national debates. These narratives offered women intellectual authority, positioning them as interpreters of society. Yet literature also reinforced restrictive ideals. Popular conduct books, poems, and serialised romances exalted the angel in the house ideal, coined by Coventry Patmore's 1854 poem of that title, which defined women as self-sacrificing domestic guardians. In magazines and children's books, female characters often modelled obedience, purity and moral influence. Literature thus became a site of ideological contest, simultaneously enabling women's voices and constraining their representations. Poetry, too, offered a platform for female expression. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh, 1856, a verse novel, asserted the seriousness of women's intellectual ambitions and their right to participate in public life. Christina Rossetti, with her devotional lyrics and enigmatic Goblin Market, 1862, negotiated themes of temptation, sisterhood, and salvation, often interpreted as allegories of female desire and resistance. These poets contributed to a broader reimagining of women's spiritual and sensual identities, challenging boundaries between the sacred and the profane. Visual art presented a more ambivalent field. Women were long excluded from professional training, denied access to life-drawing classes and prestigious academies. Yet the Victorian era saw increasing numbers of women exhibit paintings, particularly portraits, landscapes and still lifes, which were considered more appropriate for female sensibilities. Artists such as Elizabeth Siddal, associated with the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and Evelyn de Morgan, with her symbolist canvases, carved spaces for themselves despite institutional barriers. Their works often carried subtle critiques of gender roles cloaked in mythological or allegorical subjects. At the same time, women were central as subjects of art. The pre-Raphaelite ideal of the elongated, ethereal female figure, pale skin, flowing hair, distant gaze, dominated Victorian visual culture. These depictions elevated women as muses and icons, yet reduced them to aesthetic symbols, their individuality erased in favour of archetypes. The virgin, the fallen woman, the femme fatale. Such imagery both enthralled and constrained Victorian viewers, shaping cultural imagination in ways that reinforced gender hierarchies. The theatre offered another complex arena. Women had long been accepted as actresses, but Victorian respectability placed actresses in a liminal position, admired yet morally suspect. Stars such as Ellen Terry achieved renown for their Shakespearean roles, demonstrating women's ability to embody complex characters. At the same time, music halls and popular entertainments featured female performers who blurred the boundaries between art and sexuality, provoking debates about morality and propriety. The figure of the actress became a lightning rod for anxieties about gender, class, and respectability. Music, too, reflected both opportunity and exclusion. Middle-class girls were expected to learn piano and singing, cultivating skills that displayed refinement and enhanced marriage prospects. Yet professional careers as composers, conductors or instrumentalists were largely barred to women. Clara Novello and Jenny Lind, the Swedish Nightingale, achieved celebrity as singers, but institutional barriers limited broader recognition. The paradox of women's cultural presence, encouraged in private, restricted in public, was a hallmark of the Victorian age. Periodicals and salons provided intellectual forums where women could participate more openly. Journals edited or contributed to by women, such as the English Woman's Review, discussed literature, education and reform. Middle-class homes hosted salons where women writers and thinkers engaged in debate, cultivating a culture of exchange that nurtured new ideas. These spaces blurred distinctions between the domestic and the public, enabling women to influence cultural discourse under the guise of sociability. Children's literature became an important domain of women's authorship. Writers like Anna Sewell, Black Beauty 1877, and Frances Hodgson Burnett, Little Lord Fauntleroy 1886, created enduring works that shaped moral and imaginative landscapes for young readers. Their stories emphasized empathy, kindness, and social justice, embedding reformist ideals in accessible narratives. Through children's literature, women authors reached wide audiences, shaping future generations as much as contemporary debates. Cultural participation was not only about production, but also about interpretation. Women as readers, viewers and listeners became active agents in shaping taste and demand. The proliferation of lending libraries, subscription concerts and art exhibitions created a mass public sphere in which women were conspicuous consumers. Their preferences influenced publishing trends, theatrical productions and artistic movements, granting them economic power even when political rights were denied. Yet access to culture remained stratified by class. Working-class women had fewer opportunities to read novels or attend concerts, though cheap serial fiction, penny magazines, and music halls provided popular entertainment. Sunday schools and mechanics institutes offered some educational uplift, but cultural participation was shaped by economic means. Middle and upper-class women dominated literary and artistic production, while working-class women remained largely consumers or performers in less prestigious venues. The contradictions of women's cultural roles were epitomised in the figure of the new woman that emerged in the 1880s and 1890s. Independent, educated, cycling through city streets, she symbolised both aspiration and anxiety. In fiction, she appeared in the works of Sarah Grand, George Egerton and Mona Caird, who explored themes of marriage reform, sexual autonomy and professional ambition. The new woman challenged the angelic ideal, asserting cultural authority in ways that unsettled Victorian norms. By the end of the 19th century, women's contributions to culture were undeniable. They had authored masterpieces, sung on international stages, painted canvases that entered public collections, and shaped the reading habits of millions. Yet their achievements were persistently framed within debates about femininity, morality, and propriety. Culture offered a stage for recognition, but also a mirror reflecting the constraints of gender ideology. The cultural history of Victorian women reveals a paradox. Exclusion fostered creativity, and restriction stimulated innovation. Denied access to certain institutions, women invented new forms, genres, and strategies to assert themselves. They wrote novels instead of entering Parliament, composed children's stories instead of symphonies, created allegorical paintings instead of historical frescoes. Each limitation became a provocation, generating cultural works that continue to shape literature and art today. The Victorian woman in culture was not merely a passive ornament, though society often tried to cast her as such. She was an author, an artist, performer, a critic, and a consumer. She inhabited the stage, the page, and the canvas, even when excluded from the lecture hall or the ballot box. Her cultural legacy testifies to the resilience of creativity under constraint and to the enduring power of art and literature as vehicles of resistance and transformation. The Victorian era was an age of contradictions for women. On the one hand, restrictive ideals like the angel in the house defined femininity as passive, domestic, and morally submissive. On the other, a growing movement of women and male allies articulated a vision of equality that laid the foundations of modern feminism. Though the term feminist would not gain widespread usage until the late 19th century, The intellectual and practical work of Victorian women reformers deserves that name. Their campaigns reshaped law, education, labour, and social morality, carving pathways that future generations would follow. Feminist thought in Victorian Britain was diverse, reflecting differences of class, religion, and political philosophy. Some reformers emphasised women's moral influence, arguing that female participation in public life would purify politics and elevate society. Others demanded equality in unequivocal terms, challenging the legal and economic structures that subordinated women. These currents sometimes clashed, but together they created a movement that could appeal across constituencies. Legal inequality was a central focus of reform. The doctrine of coverture, which subsumed a wife's legal identity under her husband's, symbolised the broader injustice women faced. Caroline Norton's personal tragedy, in which she was denied custody of her children and control of her earnings, exposed the cruelty of existing laws. Her public writings, including English Laws for Women, 1854, rallied sympathy and support. Campaigns spearheaded by women like Norton contributed to the Custody of Infants Act, 1839, which allowed mothers limited rights to their children, and later the Matrimonial Causes Act, 1857, which introduced civil divorce. Though reforms were partial and often favoured men, they marked crucial breaches in the legal edifice of patriarchy. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 represented further victories. Before these laws, a married woman's wages and property automatically became her husband's. Reformers argued that economic independence was essential for dignity and security. The Acts granted women the right to retain earnings, inherit property, and enter contracts, transforming marital relations. These victories were not easily won. They followed years of petitioning, pamphleteering, and parliamentary debate, much of it led by women whose own lives testified to the law's injustices. Education was another domain of feminist activism. Reformers recognised that without access to knowledge, women could not hope to claim equal rights. In 1869, Emily Davies co-founded Girton College, the first residential college for women at Cambridge. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, after overcoming immense resistance, became the first woman in Britain to qualify as a physician, opening medical practice to future generations. Millicent Garrett Fawcett, her sister, became a leading suffrage campaigner and intellectual, linking educational and political rights. By the 1880s, universities including Oxford and Cambridge admitted women to examinations, though full equality remained elusive. These reforms challenged assumptions that intellect was gendered, demonstrating women's capacity to excel in disciplines once deemed exclusively male. The campaign against the Contagious Diseases Acts in the 1870s exemplified feminist resistance to state control over women's bodies. These laws authorised police to detain women suspected of prostitution in garrison towns and ports, subjecting them to invasive medical examinations. Men, however, faced no equivalent scrutiny. Josephine Butler, a devout Christian and reformer, galvanised opposition, framing the acts as violations of civil liberties and as instruments of sexual double standards. Her crusade attracted thousands of women, many from evangelical backgrounds, uniting morality with political protest. The eventual suspension of the acts in 1883 and repeal in 1886 testified to the power of organised female activism. Labour rights became increasingly important as industrialisation drew women into factories, workshops and offices. Reformers argued for limits on working hours, protection against dangerous conditions, and recognition of women's economic contributions. Trade unions initially resisted female membership, fearing competition and reduced wages, but female trade unionists like Emma Patterson founded organisations specifically for women workers. By the late 19th century, women's presence in labour movements expanded, linking feminist aims with broader struggles for social justice. Philosophical currents also shaped Victorian feminism. John Stuart Mill's The Subjection of Women, 1869, co-authored in spirit with his wife Harriet Taylor Mill, provided a theoretical foundation for equality. Mill argued that the subordination of women was a relic of barbarism incompatible with modern liberty. His reasoning appealed not only to women's rights activists, but also to liberals who saw equality as essential to progress. Women reformers cited Mill extensively, framing their demands as both rational and moral. Religion, too, played a dual role. Evangelical Christianity reinforced domestic ideals, yet it also provided women a moral platform for activism. Campaigns for temperance, abolition of slavery, and missions abroad often involved women in leadership roles, cultivating organisational skills that later translated into suffrage and feminist campaigns. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, active in Britain from the 1870s, connected moral reform with political advocacy, demonstrating how faith could underpin feminist engagement. Feminist periodicals provided crucial forums for debate. The English Woman's Review, founded in 1858, published essays on education, employment, and legal reform. The Women's Suffrage Journal, edited by Lydia Becker, connected activists across the country. Through these journals, women exchanged ideas, reported victories, and built solidarity. Print culture allowed feminism to transcend local societies, forging a national and even international movement. Despite progress, Victorian feminism faced formidable opposition. Critics warned that reforms threatened family stability and social order. Cartoons and satires mocked strong-minded women as unfeminine or ridiculous. Even Queen Victoria, paradoxically a reigning monarch, declared herself hostile to women's rights. Such opposition reveals the depth of patriarchal anxiety. Women's demands challenged not only law, but also identity, morality, and tradition. Yet by the end of the Victorian era, feminist activism had transformed the landscape. Women could own property, initiate divorce, study at universities, and participate in local government. They had repealed oppressive laws, built institutions, and articulated philosophical arguments for equality. National suffrage had not yet been achieved, but the groundwork was laid. The generation of women who organised petitions, led campaigns, and challenged convention left a legacy of resilience and possibility. The Victorian feminist movement was not monolithic. It encompassed conservative reformers who sought modest improvements, radicals who demanded sweeping change, and countless individuals whose personal struggles illuminated injustice. Together they demonstrated that progress arises not from sudden revolution, but from sustained effort, argument, and courage. Their legacy is not only in the rights eventually won, but in the transformation of consciousness. They proved that women were not passive subjects of history, but active makers of it. In retrospect, Victorian feminism appears both incomplete and indispensable. Incomplete because women remained disenfranchised, constrained by ideology, and limited by class and race. Indispensable because without these campaigns, the later triumphs of the suffragettes and 20th century feminists would have been unthinkable. The Victorian feminists carved footholds on the cliffs of inequality, enabling future climbers to ascend higher. Their voices, Caroline Norton demanding legal recognition, Josephine Butler condemning injustice, Emily Davies founding institutions, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson practicing medicine, Millicent Fawcett rallying suffragists, form a chorus of determination. They spoke in parliaments and pamphlets, pulpits and classrooms, factories and drawing rooms. Together they made the Victorian era not merely a time of restriction, but also the crucible of emancipation. The Victorian era, stretching across 6 transformative decades of the 19th century, cannot be understood without recognising the central role of women in its fabric. From drawing rooms and parlours to factories and protest marches, women's lives encapsulated the contradictions of a society in transition. They were guardians of domestic virtue, yet also agents of reform. They were idealised as moral compasses, yet denied legal autonomy. They were muses in art, yet creators of literature that reshaped culture. They were symbols of tradition, yet pioneers of change. The legacy of Victorian women is not singular, but multifaceted, reflecting the complexities of gender, class, and modernity. For women of the upper classes, life was shaped by privilege and constraint in equal measure. Surrounded by servants and wealth, they presided over households that were at once domains of influence and prisons of expectation. Their marriages were often strategic, consolidating family power and property. Yet even these women, aristocrats and heiresses, lacked basic legal rights over their wealth and children until reform began to erode coverture. Their patronage of charities, arts, and educational institutions demonstrated how privilege could be leveraged into social influence, even as personal autonomy remained limited. Middle-class women epitomised the Victorian ideal of the angel in the house. Their role was to embody purity, manage households with thrift and refinement, and serve as moral anchors for husbands and children. Yet this domestic ideology, far from confining women to passive existence, created spaces for them to engage in voluntary work, philanthropy, and education. The middle-class emphasis on literacy and respectability produced a generation of women who became authors, teachers, reformers, and campaigners. The very ideal that sought to limit them also provided cultural authority, enabling them to articulate visions of progress from within domestic respectability. For working-class women, existence was far harsher. Factories, mines, and workshops demanded their labour, often under brutal conditions. Long hours, low wages, and the constant threat of poverty shaped their lives. They balanced employment with domestic duties, sustaining families in cramped, unsanitary housing. Yet even here, resilience and agency emerged. Women participated in trade union movements, strikes, and cooperative societies, demanding recognition as workers and citizens. Their struggles illuminated the inequalities of industrial capitalism, forging links between gender and class struggles that remain relevant today. Domestic service formed another critical dimension of women's lives. Servants made up the largest female occupation in Victorian Britain, sustaining the comfort of middle and upper-class households. Their work was grueling, often marked by long hours and limited freedom. Yet service also provided stability, training, and in some cases, avenues for modest independence. The relationships between mistresses and maids reflected the broader dynamics of class and gender, intertwining solidarity with hierarchy. Health and medicine revealed additional challenges. Women were often confined by notions of fragility and hysteria, subjected to medical theories that conflated biology with destiny. Yet the era also witnessed breakthroughs. Female physicians like Elizabeth Garrett Anderson challenged professional exclusion. Midwives continued to play crucial roles, and campaigns for sanitation improved survival rates. The Victorians' obsession with health and hygiene reshaped family life, demonstrating how science and gender intersected in daily experience. Culturally, Victorian women were indispensable. They wrote novels that defined the English literary canon from the Brontes to George Eliot. They composed poetry, painted canvases, and performed on stage, asserting creative identities even in the face of exclusion. Their cultural influence extended to children's literature, journalism, and popular entertainment, shaping the moral imagination of entire generations. Even when represented as symbols, angels, muses, or fallen women, they appropriated those images, crafting counter-narratives that expressed resistance and creativity. Politically, Victorian women pressed against the boundaries of exclusion. From the early petitions of Chartist women to the organised suffrage societies of the 1860s and beyond, they demanded recognition as citizens. Campaigns for property rights, custody laws, and access to education revealed a persistent determination to challenge injustice. Figures like Caroline Norton, Josephine Butler, Emily Davies, and Millicent Garrett Fawcett embodied the diverse strategies of reform: legal, moral, educational, and political. By the end of the century, though women lacked the parliamentary vote, they had secured tangible victories that reshaped law and society. The feminist movement of the Victorian era laid intellectual and institutional foundations for the 20th century. John Stuart Mill's The Subjection of Women provided theoretical justification for equality, but it was women's lived experiences and activism that gave theory substance. The repeal of oppressive laws, the establishment of women's colleges, and the creation of suffrage organisations testified to a profound transformation. Women were no longer passive subjects of legislation, but active agents of history. The Victorian age was not uniform in its treatment of women. Class, geography, religion and race created divergent experiences. Women in rural communities faced different challenges from those in industrial cities. Colonialism further complicated identities, as British women abroad both reinforced and challenged imperial hierarchies. Some became missionaries and reformers, others benefited from systems of domination that oppressed colonised women. The Victorian woman, therefore, cannot be understood in isolation from empire, class, and race. What unites these varied experiences is the tension between ideology and reality. Ideologically, women were celebrated as moral beacons, yet practically they laboured in factories and fields. Ideologically, they were excluded from politics, yet practically they influenced public opinion, wrote policy-shaping literature, and organised reform movements. Ideologically, they were fragile and dependent. In reality, they endured poverty, childbirth, exploitation, and loss with resilience. The legacy of Victorian women lies precisely in these contradictions. Their lives reveal how oppression and empowerment coexisted, how cultural ideals constrained but also enabled, and how women across classes and contexts negotiated space within structures designed to exclude them. They did not achieve full emancipation, but they transformed the contours of society, leaving a legacy of struggle, creativity, and endurance. Today, the memory of the Victorian woman is often filtered through stereotypes. The corseted lady, the dutiful wife, the prim governess, or the militant suffragist. Yet behind these images lay millions of women whose lives were complex, diverse, and historically significant. They were readers, writers, workers, mothers, reformers, servants, and leaders. Their collective impact was not confined to the 19th century, but reverberates in modern debates about gender, labour, and equality. The Victorian woman, then, is not merely a historical figure but a symbol of transition. She stands at the threshold of modernity, carrying the burdens of tradition while forging paths into the future. Her struggles remind us that progress is rarely linear or complete, but cumulative, shaped by countless voices demanding recognition. Her achievements remind us that creativity flourishes even under constraint, and her legacy challenges us to see history not as a record of great men alone, but as a tapestry woven by women whose resilience shaped the world we inhabit. Thank you, dear listener, for accompanying me on this long journey through the lives of Victorian women. Across drawing rooms and workshops, hospitals and schools, their stories have shown us how history is never simple, but woven from countless voices, struggles, and quiet triumphs. As we close this chapter, may the echoes of their resilience bring you a sense of calm, and may their legacy remind us that progress is built step by step, often in silence. Until our next story together, I wish you peace, rest, and gentle dreams.